So how to even begin this? Most of yous probably don't know who I am. There's the camera. Most of yous probably don't know who I am. And that's fine. Doesn't really make a difference because I'm just here to talk to you. Citizen to citizen. If you're not a citizen of the United States, go ahead and watch. You'll get an interesting perspective. But who knows if you'll ever get to see this. I smoke cigarettes and cuss. And we all know censorship doesn't like smoking cigarettes, firearms, cussing. Or certain viewpoints, oddly enough. It's very strange. But regardless, the thing I want to bring up, the thing I want to talk about, point out, it is like everyone's sitting there going, Civil War, Civil War, Civil War, the coming Civil War. But here in the United States, we're already in a civil war. It's already happening. We just haven't started openly shooting each other yet. The reason I'm saying this is because most Americans do not know what an actual civil war is. We look at what they're taught is the Civil War, and they go, that's a civil war, two massive armies fighting over specific borders. No, that wasn't a civil war. That was the War of Southern Secession. Or, were you a Southerner, or are Southerner, it's the War of Northern Aggression. The Confederate States of America were a separate country. They declared their independence and they created a constitution. They were their own country. They were not part of the United States at that point. I mean, as Americans, we turn around and we say July 4th, 1776, although we had been fighting since April 19th of 75, and we weren't officially recognized as a nation until 1783, but we still claim July 4th as if we were an independent nation at that point, but we weren't. We were citizens in rebellion. We were in a civil war. But what happened in the 1860s was not a civil war. That phrasing, that terminology came about later when revisionist history began to take center stage. This is at the behest, I shouldn't say behest. It's the fault of Woodrow Wilson, let's just put it that way. His history of the United States and its people from the 1870s whitewashed American history, decimated it. The number of black Americans that were instrumental in the foundation of our nation, the number of Native Americans who were instrumental in the foundation of our nation, Spanish Americans. Shit, did you know there was a Chinese Continental? Probably not, because it's not something that anyone teaches. But revisionist history changed how we described the conflict in the 1860s. Instead of calling it the War of Southern Secession, it became the Civil War because the two nations reformed. And you could argue that they reformed, but not really. The secessionist states had to change their state constitutions in order to rejoin the Union, because the Union had voted in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which the southern states have rebelled in the first place out of fear that it might happen. They didn't secede because it was happening. They seceded because it looked like it might possibly happen. But again, You get taught a basic survey in American high schools, and even then, it's revisionist history. Revisionist history, as a traditional historian myself, is not history. It's lying. And people eat that shit up. But what we're going through now is an actual civil war. Our nation is split, and it's split along ideological views. We have a thing called a written constitution. The arguments in favor and against written constitutions you can read for yourself in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. You also need to understand that prior to the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War everywhere else, we called ourselves British citizens. Even England, Parliament, even they thought we were British citizens. After that, we were British subjects. That was one of the main reasons that the founders were so upset, because they were citizens and then suddenly they were not. And their rights no longer mattered, and the laws were different. It's a two-tiered justice system. We have one of those right now on political ideology points. But our nation is split. And one of those factions, they're fanatical. To illustrate this point, classified documents. Now, if you actually read the reporting and find proper sources that are not as biased as the rest. Really, what you should do is read several sources from varying places. Used to be you could trust the BBC, but you can't anymore. You read an independent news site, you read Fox News, you read CNN. You combine the three, leaning heavily on the independent reporter, and you'll probably get close to what's happening. But the FBI, the National Archives, they knew Trump had those documents. They knew exactly where they were in Mar-a-Lago because they had been working with Trump for months. He had them in a secure location. They said, hey, put another lock on this. It's the same lock that the FBI later cut when they did the raid for documents that they knew were there. "4 days before the midterm elections, they found classified documents from Joe Biden's time as vice president in, the Biden Penn Center. Now, there are a lot of arguments going on about presidential orders, and frankly, presidential orders, as a constitutionalist, are unconstitutional. But they're part of the system now. But the first instance in which a vice president was able to classify and declassify documents was a presidential order from George W. Bush that allowed the vice president to classify and declassify documents. But he could only declassify the documents with which he had classified, right? When I say he, I'm speaking specifically about Cheney because he was vice president at the time. Fast forward to 2009 and you get Obama and one of his presidential orders that deals with classification. It's odd because, he actually disregarded his own presidential order. I don't know what the statute is on that, because he classified things about the government programs that were spying on U.S. citizens, and that's actually a crime for the government to spy on U.S. citizens without a warrant. But they classified that shit. Snowden later let it out. But in Obama's presidential order, it also says that the vice president can classify documents and declassify documents with which he, Biden at the time, classified originally. It also stipulates that any classified document cannot be declassified after the individual has left office, and that no person who did not classify the document originally can declassify that document. Someone higher than them must do it. But again, they found Biden's documents on November 4th, and you didn't hear about it until last week. The second week of January. That's when you first heard about Biden's documents. And then it was because they found more. And they've been finding more pretty much every couple of days. They're like the coyotes and the deer around here. They get one every couple of days. But half of the country is arguing that Biden did nothing wrong while saying Trump did. Another half of the country is saying Trump didn't do anything wrong, but Biden did. The reality of the situation is that Trump did nothing wrong because as president he was capable of declassifying documents. Now the situation in which he may have done something wrong is that he did not alert anyone else that he declassified these documents, but the president has unilateral power in those matters. Biden may not have done anything wrong if those documents were documents that he initially had classified. They did not hide a crime, and he declassified them while in office and also notified someone that he did so. Both of them may have committed crimes. One of them is not in a position of power. The other currently is. Both have a special counsel looking into what they did. Both special counsels are from the opposing political faction. But it only gets better. That's just the latest thing. Yesterday, the 16th, was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Even I got upset yesterday because a very high-profile individual on Twitter said some very stupid things that completely went against everything Martin Luther King ever talked for, ever stood up for, ever fought for. That person is also a member of the faction of government that fought against everything that Martin Luther King was fighting for. But they were upset because the Republicans were talking about Martin Luther King, and they obviously didn't know what they were talking about. It is incredibly frustrating. But again, we're fighting over an important figure from our history that did great things, that helped out everyone. We're fighting over who gets to claim that person. We're already in a civil war. Half the population and the Biden administration wish to remove the Second Amendment rights from citizens without actually amending the Constitution. everything about the lockdowns that happened and how divided the country was on that. Changing the definition of words, ignoring laws, changing laws to suit a certain political faction. We are in a civil war. I mean, shit. Biden gave a speech in front of Independence Hall. It's got many names, the Red Speech, all sorts of things. For me, that was a declaration of war on half the population, because if you listen to what he's saying, he is calling for open season on people who oppose his political ideology. And immediately following that, the next week, some crazed, psychotic zealot from their faction of political thought went out and murdered a kid. Because he thought he was in a MAGA Republican group. Half of the government, including the entirety of the executive branch, have been spending the last 2 years dehumanizing, vilifying, denigrating, and calling for violence against their political opponents. Half the country loves it, and the other half of the country is sitting there going, what the fuck? You'll forgive me, I'm betting against future happiness. It's a messed up situation. It's an actual civil war. And we're all pretending it's not happening. We're all saying it's on its way, although it's already started. Democracy, democracy, democracy. We're a republic. That's not a democracy. Republics protect the rights of all minorities. Democracies, it's about majority. There are no protections for minorities in a democracy. Look at Brexit. There were not enough people in Northern Ireland, Wales, or Scotland to outvote England in leaving the EU. 51% of the population of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The other 49 did not. The other 49% were squarely centered in the smaller states in the United Kingdom. Democracy is a terrible form of government for such large populations as we have in the world today. Democracy is actually a threat to human rights and freedoms. It's like communism. Communism on a small scale works great. On a small scale. You're talking less than 100 people. Communism works great. Same with democracy. In a very small scale, democracy works great. When it gets too large, it doesn't work anymore. It becomes oppressive. But you'd have to study political theory and be honest about factual history. And be honest with yourself about what the fuck is happening now to even start comprehending how to best address it. And the problem is there is no way to address it. We've gone beyond the point where we could fix this. We're at a point where one side has to win out. Worst case scenario is we balkanize. Well, I shouldn't say that. Worst case scenario is the Democrats win, the Constitution is gone, and all of our rights that have been guaranteed for 240, what are we on? It's 2023? 247 years, well, not yet, 46, 246 years. All of those rights, well, I shouldn't say that, because the Constitution didn't come into effect until 1789, and then the amendments, the first 10 amendments, weren't ratified until 91. So really, the rights we've had since 1791 would go bye-bye instantly. Half the population wants that. So yeah, we're in a civil war. Avoid the violence as best you can. There's no reason for it. But how do you change the minds of people who have been indoctrinated? They couldn't figure that shit out after World War II, did they? Did they figure out how to deal with Nazis? Because the way people in this nation think right now, from a certain faction, mind you, and part of the other, but not as many, the way they think now is entirely through the lens of their faction, and everyone else is wrong. The Nazis were like that, but people throw that word around so much anymore it doesn't mean anything. It's like racist, or xenophobe, or bigot. Well, bigot still means something, but nobody uses it properly. Oh. But yeah, we need to find a way to fix this, but I don't know what that way is right now. Nobody wants to listen. Everybody wants their side to win out. Nobody wants this nation to return to its proper form of government. Everyone freaked out when they held off that speaker vote. Why? Because you guys don't know history. You don't know how it's supposed to work. You don't realize that it's not supposed to be two giant factions controlling every aspect of life in America. It's supposed to be a bunch of smaller factions that represent their constituents exactly. Not anymore. And then people, even the older generations that are still alive right now, are sitting there saying, you don't know. Well, no, you don't know because you never lived in the United States that had it. You don't study history. The United States changed drastically after the history of the United States and its people was published. After a deal was made in 1876 to give the Republicans the White House and allow the Democrats to regain their authority in the South. That's where Jim Crow comes from, but you guys don't know that because you don't want to look that deep. After Woodrow Wilson became president, it's a simple thing that isn't very simple at all, but Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government. You heard me right. Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government. Didn't matter where you were in the United States. After the 15th Amendment, after the, what do they call them? The Emancipation Amendments? Every federal building had to hold to those standards, even in the South. Even in the South, Black Americans were allowed to be in the same building, use the same bathrooms, drink from the same fountains, do everything that a white American could in a federal building on federal property. Until Woodrow Wilson. Then you get FDR. And FDR drastically changes the United States of America. Drastically changes the government. We all sit there and go, the FBI is the police force of America. No, the FBI is a federally created police force that completely disregarded the Constitution. Prior to them fucking up so bad in the woods in Wisconsin, the FBI could not go into a state without the governor's permission. The FBI could not operate in a state without the governor's permission. The FBI could not carry firearms. The FBI could not be the person arresting someone. And then they fucked up real bad when they were breaking a bunch of freaking laws. They killed CCC workers. If you don't know what the CCC is, it was one of the socialist programs that was absolutely necessary that FDR implemented. This is early on. This is, I believe the raid happened in 1934. Killed 3 guys. The bank robbers they were after all got away. Several FBI agents died as a result of the raid. Funny thing is, the FBI did not have the authority to operate in Wisconsin at the time. The FBI did not have the authority to commandeer vehicles, and yet one of them commandeered a Starlit private plane, and the others commandeered personal vehicles, which were later stolen by the criminals. The FBI, operating firearms they were not authorized to carry, created a whole scene of havoc. They created a shitstorm when they did this. And then after that, Congress, at this point solidly Democrat, passed legislation to allow the FBI to do all of it. And everyone just believes the FBI has always had that authority, but no. But that's part of the problem. And that's where I was going with this tangent, was that people today who do not know the actual history, the factual history, the primary sources, believe what they've been told their entire lives. And what they've been told their entire lives is not the prescribed government of our Constitution. It's some weird polystocracy where 2 factions control everything. They switch out every once in a while. One is meant to just slow down the other when the population gets a little too upset about the drastic and unconstitutional changes happening in their daily lives. I mean, we all laugh at it, because McConnell looks like a turtle as he's sitting there going, well, slow down there, Democrats. And all they do as Republicans is stop the Democrats for a couple of years until the Democrats regain power and push that shit through harder, because they were delayed. That's not government. That's a polystocracy. That's a political class that is above the rest of us. And that's unconstitutional, and that's against everything our founders believed. But you guys don't understand the complexities of their society because yours is so freaking base and uneducated. And that's where I'll leave it. Sitting here drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and talking for a half an hour.